Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. Markets are de-risking in reaction to the U.S.-Israeli military operations against the Islamic Republic. Crude oil is rallying, although we are off session highs. And if you look at U.S. equity index futures, we are lower across the board. Precious metals are moving higher. And for a closer look at some of this price action, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Paul Dobson. Paul is executive editor for Asia Markets. He joins from our studios in Singapore. Thank you for being here. So the de-risking is not a surprise. These moves, I think, seem fairly predictable. Would you agree that there's nothing to indicate a sense of broad panic?
So far, the reaction is pretty textbook, as you say, Doug. We do have stock index futures lower, but only by about 1%, so not screaming panic just yet. We had a pretty large jump in crude oil at the open, as much as 13%. Again, that moderated somewhat. And as you'd expect, we're having gains in bonds, haven currencies faring well, gold also performing strongly, but not gigantic moves. And I think, the market really needs to assess and determine how sustained this conflict is going to be, how long it's going to last, and particularly what happens to the choke point on the Strait of Hormuz and whether ships will be able to navigate that channel or whether they will all get stuck in a very big queue and then the products can't get out of there, which short term isn't an issue. Longer term could become much more challenging for the global economy.
So we know that China is a big buyer of Iranian crude. There are obviously sanctions on that oil. China seems to ignore that fact. We've got a meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Trump in about a month from now. I know we're getting into the political realm here, but can you give me a sense of what may happen in that meeting as a result of what we've seen over the weekend?
You do certainly have a feeling that China's not pleased at all by the latest events. They put out an official statement that was condemning it, saying, it breached international law, which we have heard from other places as well. And so it does make it more challenging that another one of China's allies, Maduro as well, was more China friendly, has fallen. And I guess that probably makes China feel pretty uncomfortable. Now, if it can't get hold of oil or replacements for the Iranian oil, then that would be a whole lot worse for China and for the economy and put a lot more pressure on them. So it does raise the stakes about, whether this meeting will proceed in the end, but certainly, what will be said there as a result. And I think that, that sense of encirclement will probably breed to, some kind of sense of persecution from the Chinese side of things. And China knows, they have the tools to sort of threaten the US as well, having seen how successful they were with the rare earths measures before. But neither side really wants to get back into that situation again of tit-for-tat escalations. So it will be interesting to see how the geopolitics plays into that sort of trade dynamic in the coming month.
We kind of had a shaky day in the U.S. last Friday, some weakness in NVIDIA. I think the stock was down a little more than 4%. I know that South Korea is on holiday today. So if you try to understand what's going on in the technology space, do we need to look to Japan and get a sense of what's happening?
It'll be hard to do that today just because of the geopolitical risk that's also foggying things. And also on Friday, a lot of the moves, at least in Asia, seem to be kind of end of the month, people rebalancing their portfolios, looking to take some profits, those kinds of things as well. So to discern or to separate that from everything else that's going on might be a little bit hard. We might need to wait a little bit longer into the week to get a clearer read. But you're right that there were a couple of things that were troubling in the US market performance on Friday, not just the NVIDIA thing, but also what was going on with the financial stocks, with all of the banks under a good deal of pressure, partly because of their own concerns about what AI can do in terms of disruption in the financial space, and also because more and more of those kind of credit cockroaches seem to be emerging and putting a little bit more worry about what exactly is going on in the lending markets.
We have the employment report at the end of the week here in the U.S. Obviously, that's going to be critical in terms of the bond market. But if you look at the price action in yield terms, Treasuries, the 10-year broke below 4% last Friday, to the point that you just made about the concern over what may be happening in private credit. But I'm wondering if the jobs number comes in on the soft side, whether we see further retreat in U.S. Treasury yields.
It's certainly possible, isn't it? That's what people are worried about, I think, more a lowball number than a decent number. The 2-year yield is already the lowest, I think, since 2022 as well. So people continuing to bet on the Fed being able to cut interest rates at some point. And a weaker labour number would certainly open the door to that a little bit more. I think the US economic data as a whole is quite hard to read at the moment. There's been, a good deal of more favourable numbers pointing to the idea that the consumer is still holding up relatively robustly. And the most recent jobs numbers that we've had have been a little bit more encouraging that sort of soft patch is over. But I was reading, I think you can read it a different way, and you can reel off a whole number of stats that have come in weaker than expected as well. So exactly what's going on with the economy is a little bit difficult to tease out right now. And there is still that tension between inflation and the jobs numbers and that kind of just overall confidence. So I feel like almost if equities do start to turn over because of other doubts, that may be another factor that actually creates a little bit more of a doubt in the mind of people watching the economy, and maybe helps the Fed policymakers to see a path forward to rate cuts later in the year.
So we have a couple of events this week in China. One is fairly major, that being the National People's Congress, which gets underway on Thursday. We also, on Wednesday, will have the official PMI numbers. Give me your sense of what we may learn this week, both from the data and from this NPC.
Honestly, Doug, I wouldn't get too excited about it all, just because. So I think in the MPC we'll get the growth target. Everybody's expecting that it'll be somewhere between 4.5% and 5%. So China accepting the idea that growth is going to be relatively slow, as it has been in recent years. We'll probably get more lip service to China boost the consumer, which we've seen before and haven't ever really had anything that's been a game changer there. We'll probably get more references to the property market without any real sense that there's going to be a turnaround there either. We'll probably get some more on encouraging the newer technology industries, new engines of growth, which is really where China is putting its energies and efforts. The market is already pretty keenly priced for that, but some of those AI stocks or robotic stocks or new technologies, new productive forces may continue to get a boost as a result of it. And we may hear some more about the internationalization of the yuan too. But I think that probably, the market has heard a lot of these messages before. And while there may be a little bit more of a push in some directions, perhaps a little bit more on the welfare state, which would be positive, all of those things that are already in place, the stock market slowly going higher, but the bond market struggling with the deflationary concerns, it seems like unlikely that we will get a game changer in this meeting.
Over the weekend, we had the trade data for South Korea. Boy, that export figure was pretty stupendous. I mean, a 29% increase in the month of February. I think the street was looking for something around 25%. Give me a sense of what's happening in South Korea and how the Bank of Korea may view this.
Yeah, it's a holiday in South Korea today. So as you were saying, so we won't get any big read today, but it's about, the huge demand for the memory chips that Samsung and SK Hynix are producing above all else. That's guiding those exports and really helping that humongous performance that we've seen in the Korean stock index so far this year, gains of more than 40% already, and building on what we saw in the year before as well. Those two companies making up an increasing share of the gains in the Asia Pacific index or the emerging market index as they become bigger constituents as well. And, it's a sort of tilts a little bit to a kind of uneven looking economy in some ways. I think a lot like we're seeing in other parts of the world as well, where you really have a bit of a boom going on and the exports performing extremely robustly, but maybe not filtering into all parts of the economy in an even manner.
So we were talking about geopolitical issues vis-a-vis the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and I'm wondering whether it's a surprise to you that we're not seeing more strength in the Japanese yen. It's a day of dollar strength and a little bit of weakness in the yen. Does it surprise you? Normally, we see kind of a haven trade involving the yen, but it doesn't seem to be playing out that way today.
It's true. It's not performing as strongly as the dollar. So I think that you need to map a little bit impact of higher oil prices across the Asia-Pacific region. So those countries that are very dependent on imports, well, of not just oil, but also of natural gas. And Japan is definitely one of them. India would be another. Are gonna have a little bit of a setback relative to those that are producers. So think about Malaysia, for example, as being on the other side of that equation. Australia as well, from a gas perspective, and that may have an impact on the economy, and it may have an impact, therefore, on exactly what people are pricing in as far as the exchange rate is concerned. So because Japan has to import so much oil and gas, a much higher oil price is not going to do it any favors.
Okay, Paul, we'll leave it there. It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much. Bloomberg's Paul Dobson. He is executive editor for Asia Markets, joining from Singapore here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Welcome back to the Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. Let's take a closer look at the U.S.-Israeli military operations in Iran. Earlier, President Trump said bombing in Iran will continue until his objectives have been achieved. Now, the actions have drawn criticism from members of Congress, and that's where we begin our conversation with Madeleine Dean. She is Democratic Congresswoman from Pennsylvania, and she's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Madeleine Dean spoke earlier to Bloomberg TV host Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
You put out a statement yesterday calling this action one done without the constitutionally mandated consultation of Congress. I would imagine that means you would be supportive of a war powers vote. My question to you, though, is knowing that President Trump just this afternoon said that it is expected or likely that more American lives could be lost, that we could see additional casualties in this. Would a war powers vote put any limitations on our ability to be flexible, to conduct these operations in order to protect American troops who are in theater?
I thank you both for having me on in this very serious weekend set of events. And it's funny, you and I are on the exact same spot. Just coming across my feed, it says, this is a CBS post, Trump predicts more U.S. casualties as Iran operations will, quote, continue until all of our objectives are achieved. There's a big problem with that statement. We have not been told the president's objectives. The American people were not briefed on the president's objectives. Congress was not briefed, even though he was 4 days before in front of the American people in a joint session of Congress at the State of the Union address, where he had, I believe, the obligation, the duty to make the case to us, Congress. We are the one who can declare war under Article 1, Section 8, and he and his advisors know that, and also make the case to the American people. After all, the president has demanded and has made American lives at risk. We've already seen some American casualties with 40, 50,000 military men and women in this theater. The president had an obligation not to go to a war of choice, but to come to Congress under the Constitution, but much more importantly, to go to the American people to make the case before we spend resources and spend our blood and treasure.
Congresswoman, before you joined us, we spent some time with Darrell Issa, your Republican colleague from California, who is not on board, as you might suspect, with a war powers resolution, and in fact said this doesn't even apply. He said this is not a new war. It's been going on for 50 years, and that a War Powers Act has never been tested constitutionally. I'm wondering how many folks he speaks for in the Republican conference and what that means for the debate that you're about to begin.
With due respect, I think that is nonsense. We have not been at war for 47 years since this murderous regime has been in place. He knows that. He knows better. Why you would cover up for a president and abdicate your constitutional role. Congress, after all, we're elected every 2 years because we are closest to the people. It is required, and the founders said that, it is required that the president come to us and to the American people to declare war. So I think I will be in favor of a war powers resolution to curb this president's open-ended, open-missioned attack on Iran. And please understand, nobody is shedding a tear for Ayatollah Khomeini. Nobody is shedding a tear to an end to some part of the madness and the state-sponsored terror in the region. We're just now trying to keep together the fragile peace plan after all the sponsorship of Hamas in Gaza, in the West Bank. And so I'm not confused about that. But this is an act of war. You go in, you use our military with a joint operation with Israel. You don't define the mission. Is it about ballistic missiles? Is it about the nuclear program? Is it about regime change? This was a war of choice. And it is so incendiary, so dangerous. I worry about our military members. I worry about civilians. We've already seen loss of life in Israel. I was just in Israel 2 weeks ago, in Jerusalem and in places right there. This is an extremely dangerous move by the president and his acolytes. And Congress needed to be briefed. I think maybe you've seen we're going to get a joint classified briefing Tuesday. A little late, but we'll take it. But the founders knew what they were doing when they said the power to declare war should not be in one man.
Well, when we consider Iran and the one man, well, many men who've been taken out, but the supreme leader, of course, is taken out, who was the head of what you described as a murderous regime. So as you talk about how dangerous this moment is now, is the world not safer because he is dead?
Again, I don't mourn the taking out of the Ayatollah at all.
Sure.
I don't know in balance that we are safer because look at our troops in the theater. I think you have maps on your own website showing where our military personnel and equipment is. They are all at risk. Are we safer? I don't know that we are. Something I really care about is our military personnel. I think about how many from Pennsylvania, for example, from my home state, are at risk of this. Again, the president went to war, a preemptive war, a war of choice. That's not how this works in a constitutional republic, in a democracy that is about our Constitution. You saw in a single week, this president, by the Supreme Court of by the Supreme Court of the United States, was found to be in violation of Article 1, Section 8 in terms of tariffs. Congress, only Congress, has the ability to lay tariffs, taxes on the American people. And then that very same week, Article 1, Section 8, another clause, only Congress has the power to declare war. Again, because we are closest to the people and no power to declare war should be in a single hand. Again, what I worry about is an escalation of this fighting and an incendiary message around the region and to our allies and friends in the region, not to mention the economic impact, which you are covering so very, very well with the interruption of oil. This president was elected to reduce prices for everybody, to get things under control, and to bring peace. What are we watching now?
How concerned are you about it spreading here, Congresswoman? Our own Homeland Security is a question at the moment with our Department of Homeland Security closed, realizing that this is not about ICE agents now. How worried are you about cells, terror cells in this country, about lone wolf activity in the days ahead?
That's the question, Joe. It is literally not making us safer. I'm not talking about the closure of DHS. They certainly have more funds than I would have ever wanted them to have as a result of the big ugly bill, big ugly law, I should say. But it is about keeping us safe here. This will only set off more and more strikes against us. And some of them could come to the homeland. This will set off more terror. What I really regret, Joe, is this might have been something that had to happen at some point. But I wish we had been briefed on it. And more than that, I wish we had had a Secretary of State who pursued the diplomatic path. After all, the president took us out of the JCPOA and abandoned a structure to be there and watching Iran's nuclear program. and then abandon the diplomatic talks that were taking place. This should not be Mr. Witkoff. This should not be these deputy assistants, non-confirmed folks doing this negotiation when they have so many conflicts of interest, business interests within the Middle East. This should have been the Secretary of State continuing deep, intensive diplomatic talks for peace.
That was Madeleine Dean, Democratic Congresswoman from Pennsylvania, speaking with Bloomberg TV host Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz, bringing you their conversation here on the Daybreak Asia podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia Edition podcast. Each weekday, we look at the stories shaping markets, finance, and geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel, or anywhere else you listen. Join us again tomorrow for insight on the market moves from Hong Kong to Singapore and Australia. I'm Doug Krisner, and this is Bloomberg.